Each house preserves the memories, hopes, and dreams of everyone who has lived there and everyone who will. But one particular home, located in the small town of Jericho, New York, on the northern shore of Long Island, hid in its basement a sinister secret of its owner, one that remained undiscovered for 30 years. On September 2nd, 1999, an agitated man called the Long Island police and reported that he had found an old barrel containing human remains in the basement of his house. When the detectives arrived at the address, they approached a spacious home where the shaken homeowner, Ronald Cohen, was already waiting for them. He explained that he had been clearing out his personal belongings from the house, which had been sold the day before. As he went down into the basement, he noticed that not all the debris had been removed. Among the various items, in a corner, stood a large, grimy, barrel-rusted, old, a 55-gallon drum with faded labels. Attached to the barrel was a note stating that it was too heavy to move, and that, due to its weight and chemical markings, special equipment would be required to transport it. Despite this, the movers carried the barrel outside. The man then decided to open it and see what was inside. The moment he lifted the lid, a nauseating stench hit him, but that was not the worst of it. Floating at the surface, he saw a dried, leathery human hand and a pair of women's high-heeled shoes. Everything inside was buried under a mass of granular material and covered with a thick, greenish chemical liquid. Cohen said he had lived in the house for 9 years and had never seen this barrel before. It was clear that what he had discovered deeply unsettled him. For more than 9 years he had lived in that home, unaware that this barrel had been sitting in the basement the entire time. The homeowner did not arouse any suspicion from the police. They searched the house and the basement for clues that might reveal what had happened. But by that time, the barrel had been handled by many people, and the police had little hope of obtaining the perpetrator's fingerprints. The only lead the detectives had was the barrel itself and its contents. The barrel was sent to a laboratory for analysis. There, technicians immediately noticed that it was completely filled with small black and white plastic pellets, each the size of a pea. It took several hours to scoop them out before the mummified remains could be fully uncovered. It was likely that once the lid was sealed, the oxygen inside had been depleted, halting decomposition and eventually preserving the body as a true mummy. When the mummy was removed from the barrel, it became clear that the remains belonged to a woman. She had dark hair that fell below her shoulders and was of small stature, about 150 centimeters tall. She appeared to be between 25 and 35 years old. What particularly stood out was that 2 of her front teeth had gold fillings. According to specialists, such fillings were commonly done in Central America, suggesting that the woman might have been Latina. She was dressed in a leopard print faux fur coat and a floral dress, with wool socks and shoes on her feet, clothing typical of the 1960s and 1970s. But there was something even more striking. The woman had been 8 months pregnant. At the bottom of the barrel, detectives found a thick greenish liquid. It was later determined to be a mixture of bodily fluids and green paint. Also found in the barrel was the woman's handbag, which contained her address book, a makeup kit, and a wallet holding the business card of a doctor who had long since retired. Another strange object discovered inside was a plastic stem with leaves, an item that would later play its own role in the investigation. There were no identification documents in the purse, but there was an address book. The address book had been badly damaged. Most of the entries were smudged or completely erased. It was decided to send it to specialists for restoration. In the meantime, detectives reviewed every missing person case involving Latina women from the past several decades, but none matched the description of the woman found in the barrel. It seemed as though no one had even been looking for the unfortunate victim. Normally, an investigation like this begins by gathering information about the person who she was friends with, whom she spoke to, what she did. But in this case, the police had nothing at all. The detectives decided to begin by examining the house where the barrel had been found. The home had been built in 1959. Over the past 30 years, it had had 4 different owners. This meant that before the man who discovered the barrel, 3 other families had lived there. All were successful, family-oriented people with children, and none had any issues with the law. The detectives were left utterly perplexed. It was highly unlikely that any homeowner would keep a barrel with such contents in their basement, even temporarily. While reviewing the materials collected for the case, the detective realized that everything he needed to solve the mystery was right in front of him, within the evidence and in the barrel itself. He began by focusing on the markings on the barrel, one of which read Ream, New Jersey. It was soon established that Ream was a factory that manufactured barrels. The detective went to the plant. A factory employee explained that federal law required all barrels produced there to be labeled, since many were used to store toxic substances. These barrels could be traced using their identification numbers. Each digit had a specific meaning. The number 55 indicated a 55-gallon barrel. The number 3 indicated the thickness of the steel wall. The sequence 363 meant that the barrel had been manufactured in March 1963. The green label on the barrel belonged to a chemical company that had once purchased their barrels from the plant. The detective learned that in 1970 this chemical company had been sold. The new owners explained that the green paint found in the barrel had been discontinued in that same year. As for the pellets found inside, they were used for injection molding. They were melted down to produce toy soldiers, chairs, and plastic flowers. These connections provided the police with crucial information. It became possible to assume that the woman had been placed in the barrel sometime between 1963, the year the barrel was made, and 1970, when production of the green paint stopped. Most likely the person responsible either worked at or had access to a plastics factory where the green paint and pellets were used. But searching for a factory worker 30 years later could take an enormous amount of time and still lead nowhere. Meanwhile, the results for the address book found in the barrel finally arrived. Using modern infrared technology, specialists restored the information on the erased pages, bringing clarity back to entries that had almost vanished. The key to the woman's identity had been right in front of the detectives all along. On the inside cover, they found a number preceded by the letter A. Since the woman was presumably Latina, this could have been her registration number. Every immigrant in America is assigned an identification number, and it appeared that this one belonged to her. The detective contacted the Immigration and Naturalization Service and requested information on the person associated with that number. After checking their records, they provided him with a name and a photograph from 1906, allowing investigators to finally discover who the woman was. Her name was Reyna Marroquin. A 25-year-old woman had come to conquer America from El Salvador in August of 1960. The detectives did not know what dream Reyna was chasing, but it was crucial for them to discover who had stood in the way of her plans. Over the next few days, the detective called every number listed in her address book. After contacting nearly everyone on the list, he reached the final number. It belonged to a company in Manhattan's Garment District. A woman answered the phone. The detective explained the reason for his call, and she agreed to speak with him. Her name was Katie Andrade. She had worked at the company since the early 1960s and knew Reyna well. When Katie saw Reyna's photograph, she immediately began to cry, then whispered,
"Oh my God, she's gone."
The detective nodded, and Katie proceeded to tell the story she had kept to herself for 30 years. New York, 1967, Katie and Reyna had met at a Catholic church in Manhattan. Hearing Reyna speak, Katie approached her and asked,
"Are you by any chance from El Salvador?"
Reyna replied,
"Yes."
Katie said,
"So am I."
The two women quickly found common ground and became friends. Reyna told Katie that she was divorced and had come to New York the previous year in search of a new life. She worked at a factory in the city center and lived in a Catholic shelter for young women. Reyna always wore a smile and threw herself wholeheartedly into her activities. She had a good reputation at the church where all the parishioners adored her. Every day after work, Reyna studied English. The friends saw each other almost daily, sharing everything that had happened to them during the day. But Reyna always returned to her favorite topic, her boyfriend Topeno. She was in love, yet she never told even Katie his name or who he really was. Katie told the detective that he was married, as Reyna and he only met regularly on certain days. Katie worried for her friend and would often say,
"Be careful, you could end up pregnant."
To which Reyna replied,
"I'm already pregnant. Everything will be fine. My boyfriend said he'll leave his wife and rent an apartment for us."
Reyna's mysterious boyfriend kept his promise. He rented an apartment and told Reyna to quit her job, fearing that working might harm the baby. But Katie suspected that he simply didn't want anyone to know about her pregnancy, as he was still married. After Reyna moved, she and Katie kept in touch every week. If Reyna didn't call, Katie would reach out to her. Reyna seemed very happy and, in every conversation, spoke about how soon her boyfriend would leave his wife. Each month, the boyfriend took Reyna to the doctor, treated her kindly, brought her food, and provided everything she needed. She lacked nothing. Katie thought that everything in her friend's life was falling perfectly into place. One evening at the end of the workday at the company where Katie worked, the phone rang. Katie picked it up and heard the voice of her friend, Reyna. She sounded both upset and agitated. Through her tears, Reyna said,
Katie, I saw his wife. He threatened me. Everything he said was a lie.
Reyna was 8 months pregnant. Tired of waiting for her boyfriend to tell his wife the truth, she had decided to do it herself. Once she had calmed down a little, Reyna explained to Katie that she had called the boyfriend's wife and told her everything personally. After that, the boyfriend called Reyna and said he was furious with her. Katie dropped everything and hurried to her friend's home. When she approached the apartment, Katie saw that the door was open. She stepped inside and called out for her friends several times, but there was only silence in response. Entering the room, Katie noticed a single pair of Reyna's shoes lying on the kitchen floor. On the table, food had been left, still warm. Alarmed, Katie immediately ran to the police. They listened carefully to her account but refused to file a report, claiming that only a few hours had passed. The police were aware that married men sometimes ran off with pregnant mistresses, and they had no intention of investigating Reyna's disappearance. But Katie knew her friend was in trouble. She returned to work and kept calling Reyna's number, but there was no answer. Katie was consumed with worry, thinking about Reyna every day. She didn't know whom to turn to for help, didn't know Reyna's family, where they lived, or their names. From that day on, Katie never heard from Reyna again, but she always knew that something had happened to her. After the conversation, Katie gave the detectives the address of the Catholic shelter where Reyna had lived. The shelter still had records confirming her stay. According to Katie, Reyna had left the shelter during her 2nd or 3rd month of pregnancy, yet she was found in the barrel at 8 months. This indicated that Reyna had been placed in the barrel around March or April of 1967. Thanks to Katie, the detectives also learned that Reyna's boyfriend had been married, just like the 3 previous owners of the house where the barrel was discovered. Property records revealed that the section of the house where the barrel had been stored had not existed in the original blueprints. This extension to the house had been added in 1980. It was possible that the barrel ended up in the basement at that time. The next step was to determine who had built the extension. This brought the second owner of the house, Stan Miller, into the detective's focus. Miller explained that he had moved in 1972, at which time he learned that the extension had been built illegally. Later in 1980, he obtained the necessary permits and completed all required paperwork for the addition. Miller also added that he had been aware of the barrel but assumed it had been left behind from construction work and paid it no attention. He suggested the detectives speak with a man named Howard Elkins, who had lived in the house before him. Investigating Elkins' past, the detectives learned that at the time Reyna had been placed in the barrel, he was 40 years old. He was married with 3 children and was considered a law-abiding citizen. Yet something stood out. Elkins had a successful career thanks to his father-in-law, who had made him a partner in a plastics manufacturing company. At the bottom of the barrel, investigators had found a plastic leaf and green paint. The first owner of the house had managed a company that produced such items, including flowers, and had used green paint for coloring them. Elkins had worked at the factory for nearly 20 years alongside his father-in-law and another male partner named Melvin Gangton. After the company closed in 1972, Elkins sold his house and moved with his family to Florida. The detectives traveled to Florida to speak with him. Before meeting Elkins, however, they decided to follow up on their suspicions and visited his former business partner, Melvin, who also lived in Florida. First, they showed Melvin the barrel. He immediately confirmed that such barrels had been used to store green paint. He also recognized the pellets found inside the barrel. The detectives questioned Melvin about his former partner. Melvin said that Howard was technically skilled, very strong, and physically imposing. He also mentioned that Elkins had a young Latina mistress with long black hair and gold teeth. The detectives realized that Melvin was describing Reyna. He did not know her name, but remembered that she had worked at the factory for about a year. One day, she simply stopped coming to work, and no one ever saw her again. Melvin also remembered something else unusual, a furious call from the landlord in New Jersey, where Elkins had rented an apartment for Reyna. The landlord had threatened that if Howard did not pay the rent, he would throw all of his personal belongings onto the street. Melvin relayed the message to Elkins, who immediately got into his car and drove off. That evening, he returned with a television and a suitcase. While in 1967, Melvin had not understood what was happening, 30 years later, the detectives were certain. Elkins had taken all of Reyna's belongings from the apartment, while Reyna herself had already been placed in a barrel in the basement of his house. 7 days had passed since the remains of 25-year-old Reyna Marroquin had been discovered in the Long Island barrel. The detectives now stood at the doorstep of Howard Elkins' home in Florida. When Elkins saw them, he appeared shocked. For 30 minutes, he insisted that he had never seen the barrel or its contents. The detectives asked Elkins if he had ever been involved with a woman who worked at the factory. Elkins admitted that he had been involved with one woman, but it had been a long time ago and the affair lasted only briefly. When his father-in-law learned about it, he told Elkins to end the relationship immediately, and Elkins complied. When asked the woman's name, he said he could not remember it. The detectives showed him photographs, but he insisted he had never met her. At that point, the detectives confronted him, saying they were certain he had disposed of the woman and placed her in the barrel. Suddenly, the conversation was interrupted by a phone call from Elkins' wife. During the call, Elkins never mentioned the detectives' visit to their home. After speaking with his wife, he told the detectives that they would have to leave. Clearly, they had no other choice. In Florida, the detectives had no jurisdiction, no warrant, and no authority to make an arrest. But as they left, they told Elkins, "We are leaving now, but we will return soon with an arrest warrant." One of the detectives immediately called his superior and requested an arrest warrant for Howard Elkins. On September 10th, the detectives received a call from the Florida police reporting that Howard Elkins' wife had filed a missing person report. Elkins had disappeared early that morning from his home without taking his wallet. The Florida police immediately began searching all the places he might have gone. 45 minutes later, they found him dead in the house of his best friend, who was away on vacation. Elkins was in the garage, sitting in the back seat of his friend's car. The detectives were certain that Howard Elkins had realized it was finally time to answer for his actions. Instead, he chose to end his life and avoid facing trial. In New York, the laboratory compared Elkins' DNA with that of Reyna's unborn child, and the match was confirmed. Reyna had lain in the barrel for 30 years, while all this time Elkins lived quietly, raising 3 children of his own. Katie Andrade, Reyna's friend, still blames herself and says, "For many years I thought that if I had arrived just 5 or 10 minutes earlier, Reyna would still be alive." The police located Reyna's family. For 30 years, her mother had no idea what had happened to her daughter or where to search for her. Reyna was transported back to El Salvador and laid to rest in the family plot. Soon after, her mother passed away as well and was buried beside her daughter. This story leaves a deep impression, highlighting how fragile life can be and how the consequences of one person's choices can reverberate for decades. It also reminds us of the courage and determination of those who never gave up seeking the truth. Take a moment to reflect, share your thoughts, and honor the memory of Reyna. Support the video with a like and subscribe to the channel. Take care of yourselves and see you next time.